I'm ready.
Okay, so yeah. All right, so we are here with Martin Luther in the Great Tradition, which I was, I'll be honest, I was slightly surprised to see Martin Luther in the Great Tradition because I've only known him as a reformer. And I didn't realize how important education was to him, and that he even wrote about it specifically. So I was a little surprised. So I think, like me, most people know him as the reformer, but he was also he started out as a monk, but he spent most of his time as a professor. He was a theologian and a professor, and so that his life was educating somebody, for the most part. Um, and this section that we're reading is an excerpt, um, from to the councilmen of all cities in Germany that they establish and maintain Christian schools. So it's one thing I think with this episode, this section, is remembering that this is to councilmen. It's not to parents, it's not to school teachers. This is specifically written to councilmen for what he's saying they need to create. And so I think that's really important in the way that we think about this passage, um, to help us process through it and understand why he's speaking the way he is and what he's saying. But those are my opening thoughts. Just open it up. What stood out
Yeah,
to you? Where do you want to go with this?
yeah, good. Okay, yeah. So I'll give you a a great article. I liked how he said, Jennifer, that he focused on the study of Latin, Greek, yeah, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, I believe. Yeah, I think he said they need to be well versed in Latin, Greek, and the liberal arts. So I agree there with him. And I want to pose a question to yourself and others who might listen to this video. In the classical renewal in America, Jennifer, do they do they make mention of studying Greek? Because I hear a lot about Latin,
Mhm.
but I don't always hear the word Greek. Maybe I'm mistaken. I don't know, from your experience in the renewal in America, is there more emphasis on Latin and Greek from your knowledge? If
There's a
that's
ton of emphasis on Latin, and
Mhm.
there is a smaller emphasis on Greek. There are several of the publishers do have we do have several options for Greek curriculum for all the way from elementary school and up. Um, it's less popular than Latin in the classical circles. Most classical schools have Latin or Spanish and
Yeah.
possibly French, um, as their primary languages that they offer at schools. And most homeschooling families in the classical world will find some way to introduce Latin, unless they're Greek Orthodox, or there's another reason why they want to study Greek or prefer it. Um, and then in the homeschooling families, you'll see a lot more flexibility in terms of their interests. Like there might be missionary families, or students are just interested in a particular language, so they can then follow their interests. But that's usually how language study works here.
Okay.
However, I will say, I don't know if you've read or heard of the book The Trivium by the Blue Dorns. Do you have that, or have you read that?
I haven't. No.
It's one of the, oh, it came out not that um distant from when Susan Wise Bauer wrote her book The Well-Trained Mind. Those were like the two books that you would get if you were interested in classical homeschooling. um but in the Blue Dorn book, they really emphasize Greek and Hebrew. So Latin, Greek, and Hebrew as the primary languages. And she makes in that book several of the same arguments that Martin Luther makes in this excerpt as
Hmm.
to why, because they're the languages that scripture was given to
Yeah.
us in, and therefore there's they're more important.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. I'll try and hunt that book, the Blue Dawn book. Yep.
Yeah.
By
There
Peggy.
yeah.
Okay, and I thank you for sharing that insight. Yes.
Mhm.
The other thing, yeah, I had a few other points. He did say also on page 373,
Mhm.
he says in the middle of the book, in the middle of the page, he says it takes extraordinary people to bring children up right and teach them well.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's still applicable today.
Mhm.
Um, you, and I think even as classical teachers, we have to make sure that we're extraordinary, that we're doing the best for our students.
Mhm.
But then he says the great majority of parents, unfortunately, are wholly unfitted for this task, as in they do not know how children should be brought up and taught, for they themselves have learned nothing but how to care for their bellies. Um, I think the other problem we have, Jennifer, is that we have parents who who not only don't know how to educate their kids, but they don't know how to educate their kids classically.
Mhm.
They haven't been classically trained.
Right.
Yes. So do you think it's imperative that a parent has to be classically trained before they can do classical homeschooling, for example? I mean, what if they're not classically trained? Does that mean don't even bother, don't even attempt it? What are your thoughts?
Yeah,
That's a
I
question.
think
Yeah, because he's saying it's taking extraordinary people. So can we be too harsh on the parents and say, no, you haven't been classically trained?
yeah, I think that's a really good question to face. I know that in the homeschooling world, I train a lot of homeschooling moms. That's a big part of my work. And so that I noticed that there's a lot of concern within the homeschooling community, like, am I good enough for this? It's an insecurity that they struggle with a lot. And classical teachers too, people who are thrust into teaching in classical schools that have zero experience. They're like, say what? What are you asking me to do? And so I think so I have several thoughts on this. um, First, as it relates to the text, when he's talking about learn nothing but how to care for their bellies, and then it takes extraordinary people. That made me think of what C.S. Lewis talks about in Abolition of Man, the head, the chest, and the belly, and those distinctions of our immaterial aspects. And so when I read that, I hear somebody who's ruled by the belly, by their appetites. So their virtue that they have access to isn't any. And so not that they're like the evil intended people that he talks about in the paragraph before, but this is like a different class where they just haven't cultivated any virtue. And so in their appetites drive them, which I don't think is necessarily a I don't think he's saying something about their ability in terms of how to teach these subjects kind of thing in that paragraph. But and to your question, I think that um in order to ask whether people should be able to teach classically without being trained classically, I think we first have to know, well, what does it mean to even teach classically? And and what do we mean by being trained? Um, One of the things I have learned in my journey of engaging with the classics is I will never be done becoming a classical teacher. It's a lifelong journey, like repentance, but like sanctification. And in fact, I this is part of what I was talking about in the article I wrote for you guys. Um, like, what is a classical teacher? And and so there's this spectrum of milestones of mastery. Everyone has a first year teaching and they're horrible. Like, you can't get away from that. Even if we're not even talking about classical education and we're just talking about public school education, and you've gone through the traditional training, if we're assessing like education there, even those teachers have to have mentor teachers for, I think, 3 years in North
And
Carolina, I
in
believe,
Australia. Yes.
to help teach them how to teach and answer
Mm.
questions and get into a flow. And then you look at somebody who's a master teacher, like 20 years in, you're like, whoa, can I just sit at your feet and learn from you? How did you get so good? Like, nobody can be trained into being a 20-year teacher. Only life can do that. Only experience can do that. And so that's one part of the answer. The other part of the answer is asking like, well, I believe that there are certain skills and a certain mindset primarily that makes one a classical teacher. My favorite definition of classical education is by David Hicks, and he says that classical education is not preeminently of a specific time or place, but stands instead for the development of conscious through myth and of style through language. I'm butchering it right now, but he says it's a spirit of inquiry.
Yes, yes.
Is
Yes.
that's the key thing that he says that it is. And so when I'm training classical teachers, the primary thing I want to develop in them is their heart and mind leaning into that spirit of inquiry, which requires trust and courage and openness and studiousness. And so there's these ways of being that I find primarily distinguish the classical teacher from a traditional teacher. With that said, one of the things I have learned is that many people have that naturally. They have not closed themselves off from being curious and open. If somebody has that, they can very quickly begin teaching classically fairly well. Now, obviously, on that milestone spectrum of just beginning, and then there's the particulars of learning the 7 liberal arts, and so you have to learn your form. Like if I'm teaching literature, well, how do I read literature in a literary way, and then how do I show somebody else how to read literature in a literary way? Yeah, we need to learn some of that stuff, and we definitely need to learn all of that, but I think it's on a milestone basis. So I think that to just teach according to whatever you think, that doesn't work if you want to teach classically. You have to know what classical teaching is, and then that can give us the insight and wisdom for then how do we proceed, and how much training is actually necessary before we can be like, okay, I'm practicing this thing. I'm leaning into this thing. I think sometimes we think that, and from my coaching, this is one thing I've noticed, is people think they need to be much more trained than they really need to be before they can begin. Almost like that, that idea, well, I'm going to work out and look better before I go to the gym because I want to look better when I go to the gym. It's not how it works. You learn by leaning in. So yeah, I think, yes, you have to get some training before you can teach classically, but that training can look a lot of different ways. And in my opinion, it looks like developing the mindset, the spirit of inquiry, which isn't a skill set you generally have to learn. Usually it's, you have to learn how to stop putting your walls up. So it's more of an emotional thing and a mindset thing. And then learning how to read books and teach others to read books. If you don't know how to do that, you'll have to learn that.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's my long-winded answer. My opinion.
Great insight. Thank you. Yes, I think I've got too much techne in me because it's the way we've been brought up and the way we've been educated. It's a process, it's all A to B to C. Yeah, you're right. We can't. We have to think outside of those parameters. You're right. Yeah. No, I agree.
There's something really powerful about ways of being that energize and animate and give life to the smallest task.
That's right. Yes, that's right. It's not just tick. I'm a person that just tick the box. Have I done that? Have I met these criteria next? It's, yeah, you're right. It's amazing what progressive education does to us, isn't it?
I mean, we struggle with that too here. It's like, okay, but tell me the next thing I need to do. Like everyone is so stressed out about, like, they're like, no, I need to know the checkbox. I need to know, okay. Or they don't feel like they've classically taught enough if they haven't done all sorts of assignments.
Yes, or correct. Or read these books and done that. Yes.
Yes. This, I say, okay, I'm glad we're talking about this because I think learning to write learning objectives is like one of the best things a homeschool mom or a classroom teacher or anyone trying to be a classical teacher can do, not to necessarily show their students, although you could, but to make it clear to yourself of what you're trying to do in that
Oh,
moment.
yes. Yes.
So many times we just start doing things and we don't even know why we're doing them. Like, okay, we're going to read the Iliad and it's going to be great and we're all going to be amazing after it. And we just launch into this book and we don't even know what we're doing. Like, what am I trying to cause? Do I just want them to fall in love with the book? Am I trying to coach a skill? Is it, what do I want the outcome to be? And even if it is just to enjoy the book, to be able to name that and say that, like, that is so powerful. And then if we're like, I don't actually know, I just know I'm supposed to be reading the Iliad. Well, then we can admit that to ourselves and we can be like, okay, what should my learning objectives be? Is there a should here about like what I should be trying to create, or what we should want to see as a result of this encounter? And so it offers an opportunity for self-assessment and for clarity, and to make sure that our practice is lined up with our intention, and what we're actually doing, or what
Yes.
we actually want to see happening.
Thank you. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, well said, Jennifer. Well said. Um, I-
Surprised I can speak. I'm like
no,
this
that's
morning
good.
drinking so much tea.
Yes. Uh, um, shall I share some other thoughts I had from
Yes,
this?
I want to hear what you think about.
Yes. Um, on page 378, 379, he talks about no effort or expense should be spared to provide good libraries of book repositories, especially in the larger cities which can well afford it. So he talks about libraries, and I read in this article over here, the one I mentioned to you earlier, he mentioned that, yeah, the importance of libraries. This is essential not only that page 378, the bottom. This is essential not only that those who are to be our spiritual and temple leaders may have books to read and study, but also that the good books may be preserved and not lost, together with the arts and languages which we now have by the grace of God. So I like his concern about not losing, keeping stock of the great books in the libraries, not putting them down. And it made me think, Jennifer, the cancel culture that we have. I'm sure it's evident in your country. It's very evident in Australia, where they're saying to us, don't read Homer or don't read this particular great book. And when I read that, I go, wow, if only you were around, if only you were alive today, Martin Luther, because in the developed countries, sorry, they are asking us not to have those books in libraries. And before I allow you, I'll get your my other thoughts too about this is, but what about the personal library? They can take the books away from the school libraries, from the
I'll buy
public
those
libraries.
from you.
They can't take the books away from my shelf and your shelf.
Right.
And I think parents have got so much, no one can walk into yours and say, you can't have that book on your shelf. So even though there's cancel culture happening in our countries, both of them, I think ultimately the parents can decide what books his or her son or daughter will read. But it's sad that in public libraries, it's happening. And also in universities, in universities, they're saying to take those books down. So yeah, that really got me thinking about books and libraries and how far we've come from what he said.
Yeah.
The cancel culture.
That is a sad reality. Well,
Yeah.
I'm building my home library, walls and bookshelves.
Excellent. And I'm wondering, maybe this is an odd question. Do you think they would have had children's versions of Homer and back in Martin Luther's day? I don't, how now parents can get children's versions of Dante, children's versions of the Aesop's. Do you think they would have had or just been the one?
I would doubt it. But one thing I realized in reading this is I don't know very much about the state of, like, I know that the printing press was created around this time, but in terms of specifics, I don't know that history well enough. My assumption is any children's version would be a parent retelling something, but also you're just on the onset or the after the Italian Renaissance here. And so the Greek language and those books are really just being introduced. So they had Virgil, but they didn't really have Homer. So I don't actually know how familiar that they would be with
Okay.
Homer. I don't know when that became a part of the Western tradition. Yeah.
Yes, because he doesn't mention, it just says good books. It doesn't give examples.
He
Like,
talks pretty badly about Aristotle though.
oh yeah, towards the yes.
He's a
He's very
name
critical of it.
caller. He legit calls, he's just calling everybody names. I'm like, what are we,
Yes,
12? Like, what's happening?
yes, correct. Um, and the other thing I wanted to say, Jennifer, is, and again, look, I'm just being honest, and I'm just expressing my view. I'm not happy
Press
how
it. We are here for it.
he's critical of monasteries. Yeah, he's critical of monasteries on page 373, and also towards the end on page 379. He goes, in addition to this, he let in those those devil masks, the monks. Yes, so again, obviously, you know, Luther was not very happy with monks and monasteries, but I believe that look, monks and nuns do have a place, and let's correct me if I'm wrong, Jennifer, but they were the ones that wrote the books, you know, and they kept them in their repository. They translated and they wrote them, so that took time, that took effort. How can you now say that they're devils? You know, I mean, I was taken a bit aback by that.
Yeah. I mean, he does say in here, he points back to the time when monasteries were the ones that were preserving this. So he does mention that. The question it raises for me is, what really was the state of monasteries? Was it really like had it become so corrupt that really this is the state of things? And so maybe there is some truth in it. I don't know. That part of I'm revealing my bias in terms of what part of history I spend the most time with, which is ancient history. And so I'm like, oh, Jennifer, you need to expand your horizons and get out of ancient Greece. Go explore other things. So yeah, that in American history, it's like I like ancient history and American history, and that's what I teach, but it's also the classes I teach primarily, so that's where I spend most of my time.
No, that's cool.
But I am curious, like I feel like there's so much I need to understand about his culture in order to properly interpret. That was the feeling I was getting when I read it. There were several things where I wanted to react, and I'm like, is he being this extreme? Like, yes. Really? Or is it actually this way? But he also seems like a very passionate person anyway.
He does, yes. That's right. The other thing I wanted to say is that he also says, on page 377, I also wrote, so in the middle of the page 377, Jennifer, he said, I'll read it slowly. But you say, everyone may teach his sons and daughters himself, or at least train them in proper discipline. Answer, yes. We can readily see what such teaching and training amount to, even when the training is done to perfection and succeeds. The net result is little more than a certain enforced outward respectability. Underneath, they are nothing but the same old black blockhead. So, correct me if I'm wrong. So I think he's not happy with the parents as educators in the home. Was that your interpretation when yes. But if children, and then he says, but if children were instructed and trained in school, so hold on a second, you're being a bit harsh to the parents. I don't know, is that how you know?
Yeah, yeah, I felt the same way, and this is what we were talking about last night. We were like, last night we were like, we just don't agree with him, and what I guess the question, because I always, when I'm reading something, I always want to give somebody the benefit of the doubt and be like,
Mhm.
okay, let me check my understanding first, make sure I'm understanding, and am I missing something here? Like,
Yeah.
is he saying a true thing, given the context that he lives in? Like, is this actually the state of parents, um, in his culture? Is there, generally speaking, are parents uneducated and they don't know how to read, and like, is that predominantly what's happening? um if that's the case, then he's probably right. Like, if you don't know how to read, you can't teach somebody how to read. um
Yeah.
so I don't know enough about the state of the average person in Germany at this time to
Yeah.
know how to understand this.
I came to that conclusion. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
So if he was saying this about America, I would absolutely completely disagree. But we also live in a different time. We have access to books everywhere. We have the
Mm.
internet. I mean, you can, with just found resources, provide a really good education to your kids in terms of, showing that what he lists out here in terms of telling them the stories of kingdoms and princes and men and women, like all the history stories. And you
Yes,
know, you have access to all of this and can listen to it. You don't have to have a parent read it to you. You can even have an
correct.
audiobook. Like, so there's so, and then we also do have public education. So even if somebody is in a home where parents are illiterate, they're going to get something. And not to mention the culture and tells stories. I find it very hard to believe that an entire culture in Germany has nobody that is passing on stories, which is a form of education, which then allows somebody to speak intelligently about many things. Maybe not Greek and Latin, but to say there's not a robust life of the mind unless you've studied, like there's nothing available to you, which is what he says. I just don't agree with that. I don't think that's a thing.
Yes, 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 yes. Correct. But no, yeah, but you're right. It would be interesting to see what was the context and the particular circumstances at that time in Germany. Yes,
Yeah.
that's yeah, that's thanks for sharing that, Jennifer.
Yeah. What did
Um,
you think of it? I mean, you said you thought he was being hard on him. How
yeah,
would
I
you
think
like reconcile that in your own mind? Like, what do you think?
no, I like you're saying. I mean, there's so many. You can't. Look, I'll be honest with you. Parents are the first educators.
Mhm.
That's a Christian maxim. So give them the benefit of the doubt. They're not perfect, but um, and he doesn't say it in this whole article, but I believe, and I'll say this slightly, if parents pray for their children, if parents ask for God and pray and ask, help me be a good teacher to my students, then God will answer that prayer. Now God will assist, God will provide, as we say. Yeah, don't just rely on parents' human capacity. You know what I mean? So
Right.
sometimes parents say, there's no way I can do. I can help my kids, and then I say something happened to my kid. He's now listening to me, shows love to me, and he goes, "Con, I think it's because I was praying. I think it was through prayer for my kids." I go, "Yes, you're probably right." I go,
Yeah.
you can go. I go, you can do all the courses, you can read all the self-help books, you can go all of these courses, but if you pray to God and say, "Help me be a good educator," God will listen to your prayer if it's in humility. I believe in that, and
Absolutely.
I don't see that. I don't see this in yeah, I don't see this in our good friend Martin Luther King. Is what about the power of prayer, intercessions? Pray. I mean, obviously, in my tradition, we pray to the saints. We ask for their intercessions. No, the saints listen to the saints can see what parents are going through. No,
Mhm.
and I believe in the year 2022, of course, parents have got it hard. They've got it very hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not married. I don't have kids, but then I have friends who are married and they've got kids, and I see what they go through. It's which
Yeah.
I had to say. So I have another off topic, but
I
anyway.
love that though. I really appreciate you saying that. It reminds me of the verse
Oh,
in Isaiah 54 where it says, God himself will teach our children. Like, if God is our father, then, and that's the first creator and father, that's the first metaphor, or not metaphor, that's the first image that we have of God when he were, introduced in scripture. Then how much more would a perfect father concern himself with the development of his children, which then puts me and my child on equal footing before the Father, because we are both his children in the same way.
Yes.
Not, my child is not less of God's child than I
No.
am. The same.
Yes, yes, yes. And God can see your struggles and your concerns and your anguish, in bringing them up, and he's not gonna just say, "Oh, Jennifer, you work it out." No, he's gonna say,
Yeah,
"Jennifer,
it's like,
yeah,
good luck,
yeah,
God. You know me, right? You did
yeah,
make me, right?
that's right." That's right. He's gonna say, "Jennifer, I'm here to guide you, to hold your hand. That's right, to help you in the journey. Not this." I think some people forget that. They forget that. Yeah, so I just want, yeah, so that was my reading. I also, at the bottom of page 377, I noticed gymnastic. He says, he doesn't say the word, but he says on the bottom of page 377, Jennifer, since the young must always be hopping and skipping, or at least doing something that they enjoy, and since one cannot very well forbid this, I think by that he means the sporting. Is that right? Hopping, skipping, running. No, no, nor would it be wise to forbid them everything. Why then should we
Yeah.
not? Yeah. So obviously he focuses on the gymnastic. Was that your? I don't know.
Oh,
Is
I
that?
didn't even think about gymnastic. When I read, but I think that's I like that connection. When I read that, I just thought he was like, I was pleased to read that, because I thought, oh, this man is mindful of the limits and possibilities of what children can do with their bodies. Like, he knows there's going to skip and jump, and you should let them and not make them stop. And then he contrasts that with the hellacious environment that he went to school in, where it's like whips and chains and
Yes, 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 yes.
strict discipline.
Correct, yes.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then further down, and now this is further down from what you just said. So the last sentence of page 377 and 370. Now can I read it slowly? It says, "For my part, if I had children and could manage it, I would have them study not only languages and history, but also singing and music together with the whole of mathematics." So wow. So I see I'm seeing there a lot. Oh, yeah, I'm seeing there singing the music. So was that with the quadrivium? That's obviously singing the music. So
Yep.
that's a quadrivium with the whole of mathematics. So I can see the quadrivium coming out
Yeah.
there.
Yep.
And what is all this but mere child's play? But so not just, so he says yes, history is important, languages are important, but let's not forget singing and music. So I can see a holistic, is that the word,
Yeah.
holistic? He's not just looking at the trivium, he's looking at the quadrivium. Is that how, yeah? He's looking at all seven liberal arts in those two sentences. Was that
Yeah.
your,
That's that's how I saw it. Absolutely.
good on him.
Yeah. And I just, when I read that, I thought of one of my classes this week. It was, oh yeah, I teach middle school literature and oratory, and we were in, it was oratory, and we were in a unit where we were well, that's irrelevant, but for whatever reason, the students, there was a metaphor or an analogy brought up related to music. And everyone in the class played an instrument. And they just went on this beautiful conversation using musical language. And they're like, oh, it's like this and like this. And they were, and I just had this moment where I sat back and I'm like, I get it. I get it. I get the impact that this has on the heart and the mind and the experience of a student to do these things. And it was beautiful, but it was like, yeah, okay, I get it. Yeah, this is important.
Is that like poetic language? Would you use it was like poetic? Is that?
Well, we were so in oratory, I'm teaching the monologue right now, the classic monologue, and I was talking about emphasis and how to use your voice to create emphasis in presenting lines. And from that discussion, one of the students compared it to something in music, and then we went on this extended metaphor or analogy, for understanding what I was teaching in light of what they knew about music. And it was just like this beautiful weaving together of these two realities that have a lot to do with each other anyway. But then they brought it in, and it allowed them to understand what I was teaching more. But then it was just beautiful to watch them, their minds work in that way. So,
and make that interconnection. Yeah,
yeah.
that's powerful. Yes. If you can hear that, fellow Australians, that's what we need in the households here.
And all of these kids are homeschooled, and so their parents chose to have them play an instrument and figured out how to get those lessons in their lives. And but yeah, they come to me online for their subjects, but then the other subjects are home centered, and they're all over the country.
Yes, good. Now that's good. The other thing I wanted to say is yes, okay, yes, hold on. Oh yes, page 380 to 381. So that's towards the end. He says, at the top of page 380, my advice is not to heap together all manner of books indiscriminately and think only of the number and size of the collection. I found that very interesting. I would make a judicious selection, for it is not necessary to have all the commentaries of the jurists, all the sentences of the theologians, all the, can't even say that word, questions. I don't know. I don't even know what that word means. All the of the philosophers and all the sermons of the monk. Indeed, I will discard all such dung and furnish my library with the right sort of books. Consulting with scholars as to my choice. What is the right sort of books? So who are these scholars? He doesn't really.
No. And then he calls Aristotle a really mean name, and I have feelings about that.
That's right. Why is he critical of Aristotle? Correct.
I don't know. I don't know.
He's not critical of Plato, but he's critical of I wonder.
I would have to look that up and research that more. I don't really know why he's so critical of Aristotle.
Yes. So I found that interesting. And the other thing I forgot to say is I also found another article, Jennifer, and it said that Martin Luther King was very big on music education. And I think
let me shut this door, sorry.
No worries. I read that somewhere. He was very big on music education, the choral hymns, and he was very big on sacred music. And so that's interesting. And I read that in another article about him. So interesting. So the choral. Yes.
I am curious what he mean by questions. I just think that is, I don't know why they chose to use a fancy word, but I feel like it's just questions, unless it means something very specific, which I would have to inquire more about that. But he doesn't altogether throw out pagan works, and so I am curious what his filter is. Like, what is your filter for choosing these books, and how are you what filter is then putting Aristotle as unworthy, but then these others are worthy?
That's right.
And then I also would be curious what he means by the poets. Does he have a classical sense of the poets, like imaginative literature? Like, usually Homer is considered one of the poets. I'm assuming he would be more familiar with Virgil and Ovid. But I am also curious who he would include in the list of the poets.
Yes, thank you, and thanks. And the other thing I wanted to ask you, Jennifer, is on page. So I know we're almost wrapping it up. So I know on page 372. Where it's a selection, it says Luther also offers a spirited defense of the study of Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Yes, we know that. ties education to leadership. I didn't really see that in the article. And I got the bit about the libraries, a bit about the Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. But when it says ties education to leadership,
Yeah. Okay. So where I saw that, I felt like it was sprinkled throughout. And he makes several points when he's talking to the councilman, like these people are going to rule us one day. They need
yes.
to be prepared. And then he contrasts that with the example of the Romans, that every Roman citizen was fit to rule and fit to
Yes, I
lead.
read that something. Yes, no,
Yeah,
you're
so
right.
it was
Yes.
like he kept mentioning it at different points, but it was always coming back to like, hey, this is our city, these are our people, and this is why you need to care about making sure they're educated. So we're not going to abandon them just because they didn't have parents, or that they had parents that weren't educating them. We can't abandon them. We have to care because it's our city and our future at stake, kind of thing.
Correct, correct. And thank you. And I just thought about this now, the last 3 seconds. Maybe it's a wrong, so I'm not sure what you're. It might be a bit of this reading that we've read tonight, Jennifer. It's called from to the councilman of all cities in Germany. My question is, what about the rural towns? Doesn't
Oh,
he concerned about the people that live in towns? Why only the cities in Germany? And I asked her today in the year 2022, we want also children in America that live in rural towns to have classical education. You know, well, I'm sure that yeah, and that's my next question. In the classical renewal, are they looking at towns in your country? You know, where there's not, or is it just more the cities? Are they looking at towns? And
I
yeah, I've never
think
asked
that,
that question to anyone. Is that
well, so
are we
one of
neglecting
the
the kids that live
things
in town? Yeah.
one of the things for the way our movement goes is, and I think this is a difference between the organizing bodies of education in Australia and America. I still have a lot to learn about how your country manages that. But how it works in America is usually what I notice is there will be a person or a group of people somewhere that's like, we've heard about classical education and we want this for our kids. And then they will start a school
Yes.
or something like that. So for example, I'm consulting with a school in a rural area about an hour north from me. It's a rural area, it's farm country, and this particular classical, well, now it's a classical school, but they started out just helping their families. It's a church, and the pastor was really passionate about providing about classical education, and he wants it for his families. So he decided during the pandemic to start a school, and originally it just was to help out, create a buffer, create support for his families, and then now it's a full classical school, and they brought me on this year, and I've been consulting with them and helping with their teacher training. But it was his passion, that particular man's passion, and then he has the autonomy in the way that we structure schools to file with, like, we have the Department of Non-Public Education and the Department of Public Education, and under the Department of Non-Public Education you can start a homeschool or a private school whenever you want, and then there's a list of rules, but as long as you're abiding by those, which there's not that many, you can start a school. And so then it's up to you to have funding and all that kind of stuff. If it's a public school or a charter school, that's where the state gives funding. And if you have a school that the state gives funding, there's a lot more red tape and a lot more rules. And those schools are much more difficult to start and make classical. Although there are some charter schools that are classical that are popping up. And we have several organizations, Hillsdale College and Great Hearts Academy and the Ecclesial School Initiative. Now, Ecclesial School Initiative is for private schools, but they're organizations that are like, here's this form for a classical charter school, and you can adopt it wherever you are. So that's how it works. So it's not necessarily that the classical movement in America is like, okay, plant it here, plant it here. It's not as organized as that. It's not as like an overall organizing body. It's lots of individuals being passionate and starting something when they have the opportunity and means to do so.
Right. So obviously the key factor is that there has to be a person, like in this case, a pastor who wanted to do something, and obviously
Yeah.
he reached out to yourself and maybe other people, and
Mhm.
okay. But what if that pastor wasn't there and hadn't? How would those children then? Maybe they wouldn't have had the classical because it was up to him. He said, "There you go." Oh,
Yeah,
yeah,
it was his calling. That was his responsibility.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. Okay,
Mhm.
that's yeah. Because it's interesting because yeah, it's total to all cities in Germany. Yeah. What about yeah? Well, we can't. I know we can't forget the country towns or
Right.
the.
I think this is like a time period thing too. Like if you're like way out in the country
Mm,
and you live, like how many people are going to be around you? Is it even
yeah,
practical to
yeah.
have a
That's
school out there?
right.
Like I
Children,
feel
I
like
should
it's
say.
a, you know,
Mm,
probably just an impracticality to have
yeah.
that conversation. But also, I think the other question this raises is what is his reach of responsibility? And that there's always limits to creaturely life that we have to live in. I love how Wendell Berry talks about that in his essay on poetry and marriage, where he talks about form and freedom and that paradox and how we live in that paradox. And one of the things he discusses is that we must always live in the limits of creaturely life. Like there are limits, and
Yeah.
we can be. And he doesn't say this part. This is my own thoughts on it. We can be idealists. We can have this ideal vision, but there's always the real and there's always my limits, and it's the I feel like there's always this part of our lives consist of this battle or argument with ourselves about how far can I go
Mm,
and where
yes.
do I have to stop. And and sometimes I can push myself harder than I thought I could, and other
Mm,
times I need to be like, yeah, I'm going outside of the limit of creaturely life right now. Like I'm pushing the boundary, maybe not in a helpful way.
yeah.
And so those are all two. And I also think that like in our passion and idealism for bringing classical education, we can actually cause ourselves to be more despairing because we have this huge vision. And that if it doesn't look like that, then we're not satisfied. It's not good enough. And so I
Mm,
think it's also important for us to celebrate the small victories, the one
yes. Yes.
child, the one school, the am I faithful with little? Like I think that's really important for our mental health as people trying to create something new in places.
Yes. Correct. Yeah. No. No. You're right. They're definitely right. Yeah. No. That's right. Um. Yeah, but yes, yeah, no, they're right. They're my thoughts and observations of the article. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
it was interesting, a good article, and
I
yeah,
thought so
and I
too.
think there's some points where I agreed, some points where I disagreed, but yeah, it was good on him. He wrote
Right.
it.
I'm
Yeah,
such a devotional reader. Like I
yeah,
just I whenever I read something, I want it to all be true.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
so I, you know, reading this was like this was the first excerpt from the Great Tradition where I really struggled, and I'm like,
Yeah, it wasn't
ah,
easy. It wasn't easy. It was
no.
yeah. Had to
Am
three
I
times.
allowed to disagree with you?
Yeah, well, no, why not? I mean,
Yeah,
that's it's anyway, but it's interesting that they've got him in these books in a great tradition. So obviously,
there's
you know. Oh yeah, and yeah, another thing before we wrap it up, are there Lutheran classical schools? There must be. Yeah, I
say that
think.
again.
Are there Lutheran classical
Lutheran.
schools? Yeah,
I
in
don't
America.
know.
I mean, there's Orthodox classical schools. There's
I'm sure
Catholic.
there is. I'm
There
sure there's
must be.
Lutheran
I mean,
Catholic
if there
schools.
are, have they been influenced by I'm sure, yeah, there must be Lutheran classical schools. I think I did a Google search. I think that, yeah, I think they are.
That's what
I'll,
I'm
I'll,
doing right
I'll,
now.
I'll be interested.
Yes, there are Lutheran classical schools.
Yeah, there must be, yeah. And I'll be interested to find out how they're going compared to the Catholics, Orthodox, the other Protestant groups. How are the Lutheran classical schools going?
That's a good
As a
question. That would be an
network?
interesting study, is to look at different denominations and how their
Yes.
expression of classical education looks. I mean, I don't like I'm Orthodox,
Mm,
and but
myself.
my academy isn't overtly Orthodox. It's ecumenical.
Yes.
But also I'm Orthodox and I can't be not Orthodox. So being Orthodox is my vantage point, and of course influences how I practice as a teacher. But I think there are big differences. That's a great idea to compare that.
That'll be a nice thesis, a book. Yeah.
You should
Yeah.
do that. I could see you
Yeah.
doing that.
Yeah.
Project for con. Yes,
Project for
sir.
Before because I've heard that you're writing a book, Jennifer. So well done, congratulations. I want to write a book, and the first book I want to write is the challenges and possibilities of establishing classical schools in Australia. That's it. The possibilities and challenge. That will be the title. Possibilities and challenges.
I really like that.
Yeah, and then and then the opportunity. Possibilities, challenges, and opportunities. So I speak slowly. The problems and the opportunities, or the challenges and the opportunities for classical education in Australia.
I like possibilities, because and then I like how you contrast it with the challenges, because
Yes.
You need both, and like the people who tend towards a more cynical perspective are going to need you to clearly and honestly address the challenges in order for them to respect you. And so I think so many people will paint a vision of the possibilities and what it could be, but then don't talk about the challenges. And so like how you handle that will be really interesting. Like, how do you talk about the challenges without unconvincing people that we should do this?
And that's, I've just said in the last 20 seconds, I want to start writing a book. I want to start probably in the next couple of months. I'll show you some draft, but obviously it'll be in the Australian context. And who knows? I want to start small, a few articles, and then maybe bring out a book. Who knows? Whatever's God's will, Jennifer. Because I think that would be a good book to start with as we get into this in my country. Yes.
I can see that. Well,
because that's what we're at the seminar in September. Yes. And I can't wait to get your book, Jennifer.
Woo! I'm excited. I'm enjoying writing my book. Writing.
I will promote you in Australia.
Thank you. Yeah, I finished the first chapter about the classical spirit of inquiry, and then I'm working on the next two chapters on roles in the classroom, and then the journey of learning for a student. Like, what is that like if you just look at from not knowing to knowing, like what is happening in a student when and so that third chapter is on that. So that's where we're at.
And we could have a book club about your book. Not about this, but about
because I obviously need to talk more. Oh, bless.
Why not? Why not?
All right. Well, this was fantastic. As always, I enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you. It was lovely talking to you again. And fellow Australians, when you watch this YouTube video, please, my fellow Aussies, please join these conversations.
We're having way too much fun. Somebody really needs to check us.
So please, I'm so honored to have Jennifer giving her time for us here in Australia. Please, fellow Aussies, come aboard.
Come aboard, indeed. Bye.